very much for joining us today for our conversation with Declan Moore, the head of UX for Soapbox Labs. I'm excited to have Declan here. I've been following Soapbox for many years and some of the great work they're doing in voice-related technologies related to children. And let me say, my name is Scott Traylor. I am the president of the Bay Area chapter for the Children's Media Association. For those of you who may not be members and are unfamiliar with CMA, we are a nonprofit group that supports professionals working in a variety of different children's industries. Historically, as an organization, we've been focused on linear media, television, movies, also podcasts. But with the inclusion of the Bay Area, we have expanded our mission to include interactive media and software and technology toys and research, all through the lens of DEI and social justice. If you're, just to let you know that the way we're able to bring these events to you, both online and in person, is through our membership. If you're not a member, I'd encourage you to sign up to become one. There are many great benefits to being a member, as well as if you are technology forward in the children's space, consider joining the Bay Area group. While if you're outside the Bay Area, you might miss in-person events, we also host a number of online virtual events, a number of which that are coming up will be for members only. So thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all here. And with that, why don't I hand over the speaker to Declan, our presenter today. And Declan, are you there?
I am. Sorry, my camera was acting up.
Oh, I think you're doing well. Why don't I'll let you do the introductions and we can start with the presentation. We will be watching for questions in the comments. We will save many of them for later in the presentation, unless there's something that really is very urgent that needs to be addressed right away. So take it away, Declan.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. So today I'm going to talk about some UX considerations when designing voice experiences for kids. So I have a number of slides today, so I might run through them quite quickly and leave enough time for questions at the end. But the agenda today I was going to run through is, after a brief introduction, I was going to look at voice experiences and some of those considerations that you might have to look into when designing for voice, and especially designing voice for kids, as compared to maybe a more traditional digital experience that you would have done in the past. Then we'll talk about speech repair. So by the nature of conversation, things are an organic, natural process, and things will not always go to plan. So how you deal with errors in your experience is a very important part of creating engagement in that voice first flow. And then I will touch upon testing for voice experiences, because as we all know, testing with kids is a critical part of success when we're building these products, and voice is no exception. And then at the end, happy to take any questions or comments. I had a quick video to show, but I'll skip that for the purposes of time and just give a quick overview of who Soapbox are. So for the past 10 years or so, Soapbox's mission has been to develop a kid-first speech recognition technology. So often kids are provided with hand-me-down technology that's not built for them, and kids' voices are different. So what Soapbox set out to do over the past 10 years, back in 2013, was to build a kid-focused speech technology to allow kids to use their own authentic voice. So what that means is that we know that kids speak differently, but what they say, how they speak, and where they might be speaking from are all very different to adult use cases. So Soapbox's product is built with data from over 193 countries to accommodate any accent, dialect, or heritage languages that a child may have, because it's critical to us that there is no bias in the technology. With any child-facing product or service, privacy is of course key. So one of the fundamental pillars from Soapbox has been a privacy by design approach from day one, So all data is fully encrypted and anonymous across our services. We were also the first tech company to be certified for prioritizing racial equity by Digital Promise, something we're very proud of and something I still have to read. Very brief introduction on myself. So I have over 20 years experience in interaction design, and I've been very fortunate over those years to work primarily in a K2, K5 audience, both across ed tech and consumer apps. So as part of that interaction design process, working, designing and developing content for kids has been something that I've been very passionate about over those years, and I'm trying to understand all the differences, and still am, around what we need to do to build engaging, effective experiences for kids. About 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to join Soapbox, and that's where my focus shifted full time to voice interaction. So what we do at Soapbox is work with clients to understand their use case and what they want to achieve through voice, and we work with them to develop their strategy and implement POCs and get that product to market. So to provide context for the presentation today, I just wanted to define what a voice interaction is. There's lots of different definitions around voice interaction, and a lot of the common ones we see are mainly focused on adults. So things like smart speakers or smart devices or televisions and things like that. For kids, the use cases are far more wide ranging. So just to put a bit of context on a definition. So when I think of a voice experience, I think about it firstly in interaction terms. So speech is used as a primary input. So it mightn't always be the only input that's used, but it's a key part of how a child would interact with the product or service. By the nature of it being a voice experience, it mimics conversation. So it doesn't mean it's explicitly a conversational type experience, but fundamentally you are taking turns with a device. So whether you're being prompted and responding or asked and answering, there is a implicit sort of turn-taking experience happening for the user and the product. Likewise, because voice is kind of that natural interface, the idea of having natural expression through each of those interactions, both from the product itself and from the child, is also a key part of what we consider when we're defining what voice is. To touch very briefly on the interaction types around voice, and there is a large amount, we could go into a lot more detail on this, but when we sort of start teasing out what a use case might be, we kind of put it into four main steps where it kind of starts. There's a listening and speaking piece. There's the speaking finishes, and then some form of action is taken by the product. When we think about how those interactions may start or may finish, there are sort of three main areas we consider around how we define what those interactions might be. So some of the more common ones would be something like an event-driven trigger. So this could be anything from your product asking a question, and that would trigger the listening window for the child. Another very common one, especially for the younger kids, is the idea of pressing a button or interacting with UI. So that could be a physical button if you have a toy in the market, or it could be an on-screen UI piece as well. And then we have voice triggers, which broadly speaking fall into two main camps. One is the idea of a wake word. So wake words are a very common example would be the Alexa speaker when you say, "Hey Alexa, do a thing." And sorry if I've activated someone's there in the background. Or it's when you sort of have that keyword or phrase that would prompt a device or product to start listening. It's not something you see very often used for young kids, but you do see it in the marketplace. Like even Disney have brought one out recently. And then Voice activity detection is another one. So this is a broad term that just kind of defines the concept of a device listening for speech. So it would be listening, and when it hears speech, it would start actively listening, and when the speech finishes, it would then take on that interaction. So when you're considering what interaction is best for your particular use case, it wouldn't necessarily be just one of these things. It could be a combination of the two. So one example, if we looked at the tactile experience, so that's when you press some for a button to talk. That could be a tap to start, speak, and then tap to finish, or it could be a tap to hold experience. What we have seen is one of the key reasons to use this particular interaction is that if the child needs some time to think about what they're doing next, so maybe they're trying to solve a puzzle, or they have to sort of maybe do some math in their head. So this gives agency back to the kid to take their time, decide what they want to say, and then say it. So any of these interactions are very use case dependent. And one of the things we always encourage is to test the different variations of these interactions to see which works best for your particular product or use case. The voice activity detection then is the same thing. So it's a case of you might have an event-driven trigger, so that the system may ask a question, and then there's a listening window that is defined by whether or not a kid speaks. So this is often quite useful if you want a more hands-off experience. So if the kid isn't expected to interact with the device in any way, or maybe they don't have the fine motor skills to be pressing on screen buttons. And then wake words, as we discussed, is a very similar thing. So you could wake up your device, ask it to do a particular thing, combine that with voice activity detection, end that interaction, and then go again. So it's very dependent on what you're trying to achieve, the context in which the child is interacting with the device, and also the demographic of who you're aiming the product or experience at. So when I look at voice experiences, you have to ask yourself what makes it different from a traditional interaction. So for the sake of the presentation, I just put together a very simple example of, say you had a touch-based interaction here, and the child had the opportunity to pick one of these three shapes. So if this was maybe an interactive app, or even if these were physical buttons on a toy, again, I'm trying not to pick any one exact use case here. The flow we would look at in that is that they know they can pick a shape. There's one of three options they can pick, and then it moves on to whatever the next step is in that flow. So it's quite a known quantity in terms of what you might do with those three shapes. So the question then we ask ourselves is, sometimes our customers will have a pre-existing product, or they may be starting from scratch. But the question you ask yourself is, what changes with my experience, or the thing we've authored, if we want to include voice in that experience? So I've pulled out two main areas. There's lots of nuance in terms of what this would impact with an existing product, but one of the main areas is prompting and how you let the kid know what they're able to do. So if we look at a voice-enabled version of that same use case, now it could be a multimodal experience where you do have the option to see a screen and have those items presented to you, or it could be something like a smart toy or a smart speaker where it's an audio-only output from the product. So the challenge we have with any sort of voice-driven activity is not only is the child answering via voice, more often than not, the question, the prompt, or the activity is being presented to them through audio and voice as well. from the device, whether it be through a character or speech to text or something like that, or sorry, text to speech. So when we think about prompts, and again, prompt is a sort of overall term I'm using here. This
Hello, can you hear me, everyone? I think Declan dropped unexpectedly here. We can get him, give just a moment to get him back in. Oh, there you are.
Am I back? Sorry.
You okay, Declan?
Yeah, I think my webcam has got stage fright there, so you get to all look at my keyboard as I continue presenting.
All righty. Well, I'll hand it back over.
Sorry. Yes. So just to repeat what I said there, in case I dropped off, when we're thinking about prompts, a prompt could be anything from instruction to a question. Again, I'm trying to keep all these terms quite high level because I'm trying to talk about any use case in general terms. But what we need to make sure to do when we're asking a child something in a voice first experience is to remove any sort of ambiguity or misunderstanding about what's expected of them. So the ways of doing that is when you're writing questions or writing those prompts, think about what a child would do, what language would a child understand, what words would they use. So this is something, this audience here is very familiar with. They know how to write for kids. They know how to develop this content. So these same rules apply when you're doing voice experiences. So voice is always built on the same best principles that any sort of good digital experience would be for a young kid. So when a child is being asked a question, it's important to let them know what their options are. So they need to know within context, what am I able to do at this point? And once they understand that, then you need to let them know it's their turn. Now, a lot of this stuff is very important, especially if you have an audio only sort of smart speaker experience, because the contextual clues around what's available to the kid isn't immediately available. So when we've done a lot of user testing, both ourselves and my clients, and some of the things we found, and I'm always be really interested to know if other people have found other examples, because this is by no means a complete list, is that we often find that young kids will have a tendency to answer rhetorical questions. So you might be like, wasn't that amazing? Or sort of try and keep engagement going through rhetorical questions. Young kids may answer those. The same with sort of double questions. So if you ask a question, your product or your experience will probably have taught the kid that if they're asked a question, they can answer. So if you ask two questions in quick succession, they'll have started answering the first question by the time you're trying to ask them the second one. So what this kind of talks to is the idea of cognitive load. So it's probably a concept a lot of you are familiar with, but again, it's even more important as a consideration when dealing with voice. So a lot of kids, and especially in this sort of K2 demographic, their understanding and their ability to retain information hasn't quite developed yet. So even if you do have visual cues on screen and there's other ways for you to reinforce those choices, it's very important that we don't expect the kids to retain information. So this may be relying on something happened on a previous screen, or if you provide them with too many answers. So another thing we found with clients is that they come to us and they're excited to use voice, and we're excited for their use case. And they have this idea that they can ask the kid anything, or the child can say anything, and they can go anywhere and do anything. But what we have found is that we're much better off to try and create an experience where the child feels comfortable and in control and effectively have agency over the experience they're having. So although it might feel a little counterintuitive when you're trying to author these experiences, it's sometimes better to constrain it and take the kid through it in smaller steps rather than trying to give them the option to do absolutely everything. So, for example, open-ended questions like, where do you want to go today? If you ask a child that in real life, they might know the answer. But if you give them the option to, do you want to go to the zoo or do you want to go to the toy shop? They'll have a preference there. And quite often that same choice is there. Giving them the same choice in that digital experience allows them to pick a choice, and at least you can move towards that decision. When we talk about limiting choices, I've put 3 or less in this slide, and we kind of found that's about right, because if you ask a kid something, it's like, do you want to do this thing, or this thing? Especially when they're a young kid, what's going to happen in our experience is, rather than sitting there trying to make a choice that they want, they're actually sort of switching over to recall and trying to remember the list of items. And because they tend not to want to get things wrong, they'll pick the last one they remember. So quite often you'll see, if they have an A, B, or C choice, they'll probably pick C more often than A or B. Now, again, we always encourage a lot of testing here, because these are all just general rules that we have discovered when working with clients. So a lot of that comes back to the authoring of content. Given my background, I always sort of lean towards a sort of content first approach. So when people start out on experiences, I'm like, okay, start writing would be my first decision, or my first suggestion when they start trying to figure out what that experience is. So just to sort of give some examples of those points I talked through, is that if we go back to that sort of 3 shape experience that the child may have, and we tell them to pick a shape, even if they do have that visual in front of them, we're not telling them that it's those 3 shapes we want them to choose from. Similarly, if we said, which one do you want? That's ambiguous as well, because yes, it's being said in context of showing that on screen, but we can't always assume that the kid is making that association between the two. And even if we try to change up again and get them a bit more engaged and ask them which is their favorite shape, yet again, we want them to pick one of our 3 shapes, not any shape that might be their favorite. Now, again, use cases vary, and you can sort of try how this works, because if a child gets more familiar with that experience, then maybe you can get a bit looser with some of the language. But more often than not, especially as you're starting out and onboarding that kid with that experience, it's better to be explicit and direct with some of those statements before trying to open up to some of that variability. So I'll probably say it depends, or it's use case dependent, or everything's different. So this isn't by any means the perfect question, but it's just an example of a type of question that would adhere to some of the best principles. So likewise, a child may be going through an experience, and if they go from one section to another, the context of why they're making that choice might be lost. So it's no harm to reinforce that when you're giving them that prompt. So, for example, to just explain to them why the question was being asked. So let's make a picture, or let's do a quiz, or let's pick a story. So they know the context within which they're being asked the question. And then one of the things you can do then is like, do you want to pick? So it's important that your product is asking the child, like it's having the conversation with the child as that user. And then, do you want to pick? And so it's telling them, like, what their options are. So you now have the option to pick one of these 3 items and then explicitly call out the 3 choices. So as an experience moves on, say they have to pick 3 items on this screen and 3 items on the next. You don't always have to have this full structured prompt in place. As the child gets more familiar with this same experience, you can shorten some of that down as well. So once we have a better idea what we're asking the kid, then the bigger question becomes, well, what might a kid say? So when you have this conversation experience, and again, by the nature of it being conversational and being an exchange, asking the kid a question in a natural way allows them to consider responding naturally as well. So what that means is it opens up other avenues of how they might respond to these questions. So if we go back to that original flow where we had the 3 shapes, we know that we want them to pick one of the 3 on screen. So if everything was going exactly to plan, the child might say circle, they might say triangle or square, and then we can make our choice and move on. But say they did have the screen in front of them and they're being asked to pick a shape. The shapes they have properties to them as well. So a child might know which shape they want to pick, but they mightn't be able to always express it in the way that we expect them to. So they might choose a way that's easier for them. So one example might be they might pick by color instead. So when we're considering that choice for the kid, we have to consider, okay, they might choose the color instead of the shape itself. So they might say the blue one. This also brings up the idea of it, and I fell foul of this myself because I wasn't thinking this way. But if you if you look at that square, you might consider it to be purple, or you might think it to be pink. So there might be different ways that the child might interpret the content that they're shown on screen. So again, if you've asked them a question and the backup is a visual, the visual is now reinforcing the question. So they mightn't be thinking of it as a shape, but also culturally, they might always assume that color is purple. What you don't have to do is think about absolutely every color that they might say. So, I mean, given that this is, say, for a K2 audience, they're not going to turn around and say fuchsia as the shape they want to pick. But it just, when you're teasing out some of these flows, we have to continually ask ourselves, how else could some of this information be interpreted? Again, assuming we have that screen experience, the layout that you've positioned the items on the screen, either by size or position relative to each other, become a factor in some of the child's decision making as well. So if we go into sort of thinking about it in terms of natural language, the red circle becomes the first one or the one on the left. And then the blue triangle becomes the middle one or the second one. So again, the child might, if you say, which shape do you want? And they're like, oh, the first one. So if they are treating it like a natural conversation, that is another aspect that we need to think about. So when designing multimodal experiences, so when you're combining any form of voice with visuals or audio, the range of what a child may or might not say grows with each of those assets. So if we were looking at this as a standard touch interaction, we had 3 options. And here, we're looking at 12, 15 potential things a child might say. And the really interesting one with this is that none of these are incorrect. These are all correct answers. So our role as sort of voice designers is to understand the mindset of a child and accommodate for what they might say. Because we all know kids are not going to moderate their behavior to facilitate our experience. They're going to say exactly what they want to. So this brings us to the concept of speech repair. So we're dealing with kids here. Everyone on the call knows that can be a joy, but things rarely go the way you expect them to. So when we think about the idea of errors in speech, it's actually, I've started referring to it as speech repair, because dealing with errors in speech is part of the process. It's not necessarily correct to think about it as a mistake or when things go wrong. It's just a natural part of that back and forth exchange. The main reason that we spend as much time as possible on speech repair is just to mitigate frustration for a child. So if we assume that these are independent experiences the kids are having, then the role of the product or the system is to help them get the most out of the experience. So what we need to do is look to craft responses that facilitate their engagement, their enjoyment, and at every point reduce the risk of any frustration. So it's not the most, it's often something that's thought about after the fact, but it is really something that should be included as a normal part of the authoring process when you're writing for voice. So there's many different forms to these different errors, but for the sake of the presentation, I've just put them into three broad categories. So you're also experiencing my first typo of the presentation. So unknown is kind of when we talk about if there is something that the system doesn't understand or it couldn't interpret. So maybe you're listening for certain things and it was something not on the list. The other one is the idea of silence. So if there's no response. Silence is an interesting one because especially when you're dealing with young kids, like even if you're user testing with them, to try and keep their attention on what they're doing is always a little challenging. But silence can come from one of two sort of categories. Maybe the child has decided not to continue with the experience, or maybe they're at a point in the experience where they actually don't know how to respond to the question they were asked. So they do want to answer, but for whatever reason, they don't feel comfortable responding to what was asked. Then the third one is technical. So I mean, like this experience is, like many digital experiences, dependent on, technology, connections, battery levels, all these other things that might impact the child engaging with that experience. So we need to potentially deal with that as well. The reason I bring up the sort of different categories is because what we found as well when we're testing is that it should never be the child's fault. So whatever you're trying to do with this speech repair process, you should always try and keep the process, the experience moving forward. So that's not to say you should accept incorrect answers if you're doing a quiz, or you should sort of tell the child they said something when they didn't. What we need to do is try and find ways of bringing that course correction back into the experience to allow the child to continue. So this is where there's some really interesting opportunities around using any sort of characters or IP you may have in your product. So when you're thinking about authoring the questions and the prompts and this speech repair piece, the tone that you're using to write with plays a huge part in how you might deal with some of these. So when any of these situations arise, something has happened that the child isn't engaging fully with the experience. So we need to make sure that they don't feel stupid in any way, that they're comfortable with going off track and being brought back by the system. One of the things we need to make sure to do is not to constantly ask them again and again to get the correct answer. So often with these experiences, it's more important for the kid to stay in the experience and maybe have a couple of dead ends that they need to course correct, rather than to just sit in a loop and be asked again and again, because then the child will disengage with the experience. So the simple example on the right hand side is the kid is asked a question and the response back from the kid isn't understood by the product. So then the ownership is taken back by the product saying, okay, this one's on me, I didn't hear that. Do you want to go left or right? So for whatever reason, the child hasn't understood that they need to respond, or they weren't able to, or didn't understand. So reiterating the choices they may have or the options available to them is an important way to sort of loop back on that speech repair. Say, for example, the system yet again didn't understand what the child said. It wasn't a valid response from the system side. You can then consider to just move the experience forward. Or if it's a case of maybe an educational experience, that might be a time where you might flag with a teacher that some additional support is needed, or encourage the kid to do the same thing. So testing with any digital product is critical for success. I mean, especially when we're dealing with kids and this demographic we're dealing with, testing early and testing often is, essential for us to figure out what areas of our product can we improve, what are we doing wrong, do the kids even like it? And voice is no exception to this. What's interesting about voice is that when we're testing it, we kind of have a few different options to try, rather than your sort of more standard prototyping for maybe an app or a website experience. So as we all know, content creation, content authoring is time consuming, and let's be honest, it's pretty expensive a lot of the time too. So when we're dealing with voice and we want to build out this conversational experience where we might have lots of audio, lots of media creation, we want to look at what we can do to mitigate some of that risk. So one example we can do is what is known as a table read. And this could be familiar to a lot of you if you're dealing with TV shows. It's the exact same idea. So this is where you would sit down with an early version of your script or your flow for the conversational experience, and you would sort of read it aloud in a room and just understand where the dead ends might be. So this is way before you might get kids involved. This is for you, your own staff, the content creators, just to tease out where there may be gaps in the flow. Does it feel right? And especially if you're writing for a particular IP or set of characters, does this sound like the characters? Is this how the characters would ask questions, how they'd interrupt? Does it feel natural for your experience that you're trying to create? So what this allows you to do is get some of that testing in place effectively and early without having to build anything. It's a no-code solution. And you can sort of get some of the big stuff out of the way before you start investing in more user testing. Now, like any user testing experiences, there's kind of a continuum there of complexity. So the table read is kind of at one end, where it's during the writing process. It's something you do regularly with the team just to sort of tease out the prompts, the flows. And then you can move into more sort of audio-driven prototypes and other items of complexity. But one of the more interesting approaches that we have when we're dealing with voice is the idea of a Wizard of Oz approach. So the Wizard of Oz approach is referencing the movie. There's someone behind the curtain. But fundamentally, what this experience is trying to do is replicate the experience of your product without having to build your product. So there's many different ways of doing this. There's different levels of fidelity you can go to create this experience. But what it boils down to is that this is one of the first moments where you have the opportunity to bring kids in and see how they react. So the basic setup that varies is you would have a child facing some form of your product, and then adjacent to that, sometimes in a different room, but largely hidden from the child, is the person sort of pulling the strings behind that experience. So what you might have is even a picture of the character on the screen, but then the person in the other room is just speaking into the microphone and responding to the child when they speak. So depending on your stage of development, you might have some audio recorded. You might have, audio from a TV show or voice actors already involved. You could have screen mock-ups in place, or you could have some other media to sort of create a facsimile of that experience you're trying to do. So what this allows you to do is get first-hand experience back from the kid without having to go into high-cost prototyping or content development. How strict you want to be when you do this is kind of dependent on where you are in the process as well. So you may want to go in and just test the concept of your idea. So you might go in and you start off the journey of an interactive story and let the kid sort of bring you where they want to go. And because this is a live experience, you can respond to them and just see what's of interest to that kid for that particular use case. If you're at a more mature stage of your product, you might want to be sort of a bit more strict. So you'll have your flow and your script in front of you. So if you ask them something that's not on the list, you can then sort of test out that speech repair piece and see if there's any areas where they're constantly getting stuck within that flow. And as we all know, kids testing is fantastic. It can be really enlightening. It can also be really challenging. I mean, kids will have no filter. They have no interest in how long or how much money you've spent building your product. They will just give you an unfiltered view straight away. So again, what this allows you to do is get that candid feedback in as early as possible as you develop out the product. So you can continue to bring back in the same kids, or you can bring in a new set of kids for a fresh experience as you move through that experience as well. There are sort of in-betweens. As I said, you might want to do an audio-based only approach, or you may want to bring in more than one kid, for example. One of the interesting things I hadn't really considered when testing is that some kids mightn't feel comfortable speaking out loud. It mightn't be something they're used to doing. So we found, say, with some of our educational use cases, we want the kid to do a literacy quiz. And you go in, you test it, you'd have your prompts laid out, but the kid would come in and they just wouldn't be comfortable with the concept of independently speaking to a device. So what you'd have to go back to do then is figure out some form of onboarding that increases the comfort level for that child, that they then start becoming more comfortable with speaking into that device. So as well as understanding our flows, our content deliverables and things like that, it's a really interesting way to sort of get an insight into the mindset of the kids you're dealing with. And there's always going to be unexpected things that you hadn't considered when you start testing. And that is the end of the presentation. I know I went through some sections quite fast there, so I'm happy to recover any of those points made or dive a little deeper. But Scott, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Sure. We have a number of questions from the audience. Thank you very much, Declan, for that information. I know I've made a lot of dumb prototypes out of cardboard and plastic with no components in it. And boy, you can save yourself a lot of money when you do that upfront work before you start coding or even consider manufacturing. Okay, let me scroll back here in the list. One of the first questions we have is from Matthew Pinot. Matthew, I hope I'm getting that correctly. I love this topic. It's a critical piece of building new learning experiences for children, yet it has so many underlying specific challenges. Thank you for working on it. I've been thinking of designing a voice facilitator for hands-on activity that would be able to ask questions and understand kids' responses to increase the learning experience through prompts such as, I understand you are struggling now. What materials have you used so far? And what other materials can you use, or other examples? I'm not sure if I'm conveying the question correctly here. Matthew, if you're there, is that, oh, look at that. I'm sorry, I was looking away from the screen. There you are. There's the question right there. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Declan.
Yeah, I mean, especially around some of the educational use cases we've seen with some of our clients, one of the main roles of speech tech is certainly never to replace the teacher, but we all know that educators' time with each of the kids is very limited. So what a lot of clients are looking at is how can that voice or that conversational back and forth supplement that role for the teacher so that they can dedicate their time to the kids that need it the most. So sometimes it might be an automated assessment, and sometimes people are looking at developing sort of a virtual tutor as it was. So it's a really interesting topic because teachers are irreplaceable, but there is a real opportunity there to use this technology to help kids get the attention they need. So especially with kids at home who mightn't have someone to read with them, there's opportunities there for technology to play some part in mitigating some of that risk for that child. But yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and send us an email. We'll have some chats.
Great. And I think we've got a few more questions here. The next one from Ashley Moulton. How do you get around timing issues? Kids don't often know when the mic is open and listening, and I've seen that lead to frustration, especially if they answer before the voiceover is done talking.
Yes, there's a longer answer to this one, but there's different ways of mitigating that. So one is kids will often be really keen to answer a question, especially if they know the answer. So when trying to ask the question, sort of leaving the critical information, if it makes sense, to the end, it says ask the question, and then they'll answer it as soon as they know what information is being asked. In terms of having the microphone open, one of the things we've often looked at, and we do recommend it with clients, is the idea of some sort of voice reactive UI element. So it's, say you have your UI metaphor on screen and you have your microphone button. If the kid has the opportunity to speak, if it's their turn in the process, what you can do is provide some sort of state change for that UI, whether it's scale or color or something. But as the child is talking, what you can do is make that UI element react in some way based on the mic input. So not specifically what the child is saying, but just maybe some sort of volume related animation. So as the child is speaking, it's a visual cue to them to say, the system's here, it's listening, you're being heard, please keep talking. And it's just that little extra cue for them to know that they have the opportunity to speak. And then when that element goes away or shrinks or changes color, that again gives them the cue that that window is now closed. And that's all part of something you'd look at as part of an onboarding process.
And there is another question from Ashley. Sorry, we missed your earlier question. Have you had any success with interactions where you don't give 2 or 3 explicit choices that a child would have to say? In my experience, the technology isn't good enough to understand kids if there is not a small word bank, but it would be awesome if it were more sophisticated.
If I understand the question correctly, I mean, what we have found is that, yes, I mean, the word bank thing isn't an issue. I mean, for Soapbox, right, we can listen for hundreds of words at any one interaction. So when I gave the example of the three colors. You could listen for 150 different things the kid is saying, but there, once you know what they're saying, you also need to know the answer to that or a response to that. So if you allow them to say 150 things, you have to be checking for those and have 150 potential responses waiting for them. So it's not necessarily that it can't be done. It's just that what is that experience if they pick option 119 of those 150? Where does that experience take them? And if you think of sort of a 4-year-old, their vocabulary is at a certain point. So what you need to do is make sure you have like a 90% coverage of what they might say. And we have found in our experience that is often enough to get to the next stage of that experience.
That's great. I think we have a couple of questions here from Dan Flannery. May take a moment just to call them up here. Issues related to UI elements and colorblindness. I noticed the colors of the shapes that you selected. Do you have any thoughts about that and best practices?
Yes, I definitely did that on purpose to prompt this question. No, I mean, for the sake of the presentation, it was more about the choice taking, but any good voice experience for an interaction is based on the same best practices and foundations you put in place for any digital activity. So, all the considerations you'd put in for various types of color blindness, you don't rely just on color, there is shape differential as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's something you need to test for, and it's kind of a content design question rather than a voice one. And if it was me, I'd put in a green star instead or something, and make them very different in those choices. But it's a very good question that I don't have an exact answer to at the moment. But it goes back to the fact that having voice is an extra layer of best practices. It doesn't eschew any of the pre-existing ones that this audience would be used to.
Excellent point. And I think we have one last question from Matthew again. It looks like the flow must be controlled to ensure we are able to anticipate and respond to the child's answers. What's your point of view on integration or use of generative AI and voice conversational bots for children?
Yes, generative AI, the big topic of the moment.
Yeah.
Yes, the example I gave was very controlled. And again, I was talking quite toward the young audience. And I think it's very much use case dependent. And I think given the opportunity with generative AI to sort of go back to that previous point, what if there was a larger word bank? Generative AI does allow us to sort of provide contextual responses to that. I don't have any direct examples of that at the moment, but it is something that's of interest at the moment to a lot of people, and a lot of people are talking about it. And I'm looking into it myself at the moment, but I certainly don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah, I know our whole CMA organization is also trying to think about what that might mean to our membership. If any folks out there who are participating today are aware of people working in the children's media space using generative AI, we'd love to know about it. We're trying to find experts in the field, which it's hard to say how many experts could there be with this really fast-moving new technology, but please do let us know. And why don't we put up your last slide, Declan, for people if they want to contact you. And
so if people do want to get in touch, it's get in touch with hello@soapboxlabs.com. And we do have a beginner's guide there that's a downloadable resource if people want to see some of the other topics that I talked about today in a bit more detail.
Awesome. Declan, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you all to our audience members for participating in your great questions. Let me share. Oh, I'm sorry. And I'm just noticing there are many more questions coming up too. Or it appears to me. Anyway, let me repeat again that, we're able to bring you these. Oops. Hello, can you hear me? We're able to bring these events to you through CMA, through our members and people who support these events and pay for their yearly memberships. If you're not a member, please do consider becoming a CMA member. If you are technology forward, think about joining the Bay Area group. You can join any group, but at the same time, ours specifically is focused on things related to technology, apps, software, research for kids. Just to let you know, we have a couple events coming up in January, which are in person. We have a coffee meetup on July 11th in downtown San Francisco, location to be announced. And our big announcement, which will come out, I believe, on July 2nd in a newsletter, our CMA newsletter. We have an in-person tour of the IDEO Play Lab with a presentation on new findings in interactive engagement with children. If you're in the Bay Area or you would like to fly and visit us, come on out. It's a members-only event. There'll be limited seating. We're so excited to partner with IDEO to offer that event. We have a number of really great virtual as well as in-person events coming up in the months ahead. And we're looking to engage at the global level. So keep tuned for more announcements. Thank you all for visiting today. And please check out our CMA webpage if you're looking for the membership sign up. I don't have the URL handy in front of me, but we would love to hear from you. If you have other ideas for events, please do let us know. You can reach me at scott@childrensmediaassociation.org. Thank you all again. We'll talk to you soon.